Welcome back to Economics. This is Dr. Klein. Today I'm going to talk about something I call patterns of sustainable specialization and trade, or PSST. It's kind of my alternative to the standard way of thinking about macroeconomics. Last time we talked about factor demand, and we said that there was, for labor, if this is the quantity of labor, and this is the, let's say, the wage rate, that there was a labor demand schedule. And then there would be a labor supply schedule. And let's talk about maybe the whole economy, labor demand, labor supply. And part of the mystery in economics is how there can be unemployment. Unemployment is in some sense an excess supply of labor. There are people who claim to be willing to work at the going wage, but they can't find jobs. So what it looks like is when there's unemployment, it looks as though the wage is too high. That's kind of the way, one way to look at unemployment is it must be that the wage is too high. And what that suggests is that all these tools of macroeconomics, like monetary policy and fiscal policy, are really ways to overcome this overly high wage. And therefore, it's really just a way of somehow fooling workers into accepting a wage that they otherwise would not accept, so that you end up driving the wage back down to a point where you don't have excess labor supply. Okay, there are a number of problems with that, one of which is that this theory predicts that wages will be highly countercyclical. That is, when unemployment is low, or let's do it the other way. When employment is low, it must be because real wages are high. And conversely, when employment is high, real wages are low. Well, we don't observe this pattern in the data, so that's a problem with it. And what that suggests is there are some circumstances in which perhaps labor demand maybe drops off a cliff. That is, you can reduce wages by a lot. Let's say if you reduce wages by a lot, you really wouldn't get much of an increase in employment. So that's another way of putting it, is that there's inelastic labor demand. And there could be a number of stories for this. For example, if you're an automobile manufacturer and you've got excess inventories, so they're just cars crowding the lots at dealers, the dealers are saying, don't send us any more cars, don't build us any more cars, we can't sell what we've got, then no matter how much workers are willing to cut their wages in the manufacturing plants, the automobile manufacturers are just not going to hire more workers. Or take the case of a few years ago when it seemed as if we'd built way too many houses. It wouldn't matter how much construction workers cut their wages, it just doesn't pay to build any more houses until this inventory of unsold homes gets sold off. So that's a story that might fit in some ways with traditional macroeconomics. That is, we can't sell all the stuff that we produce. There's a shortage of aggregate demand, but the labor demand is so inelastic that sort of cutting wages isn't the cure-all, that there's got to be some other mechanisms to remove the aggregate, the excess supply of goods. And once you remove the excess supply of goods, then you can remove the excess supply of labor. So the excess supply of output is what drives excess supply of labor. So maybe you can tell that story. I think that it raises the question then of why it just transforms the question to being one of why is there an excess supply of labor to why is there an excess supply of goods? Because once again, you would think that if there's an excess supply of goods, all it takes is a cut in price and the excess supply of goods is removed. And so once again we have this question of how can there be this this persistent excess supply of goods, if that's in turn, or excess supply of output, that's presumably driving the excess supply of labor. So those are sort of the puzzles of macroeconomics. And so what I go for with patterns of sustainable specialization and trade is to tell a different story, that that the economy occasionally gets caught massively out of adjustment. So unlike macro, I don't think in terms of what we call homogeneous labor. That is, people as workers are very interchangeable. If they're homogeneous, they're highly interchangeable. Can move easily across firms and industries. So I drop that assumption, which is kind of implicit in a lot of macroeconomics, and instead picture people in different occupations, industries, as being a bit like in different countries. So so you have people located in these various occupations, and they have various trading patterns with each other. This one might sell to this one might sell to this one, this might sell to this one. That would be a simple case of sort of, three occupations. Of course, we have thousands and thousands of different occupations in this country as our economy has grown more and more complex. And so so you develop trading patterns, and you might have a trading pattern in which everyone's employed. But you might also develop a pattern, let's say, in which, this is not a realistic sketch, but imagine we no longer needed this one. So that this person can produce, or this occupation can produce what this occupation wants efficiently, and this one can produce that efficiently. Then what happens with this? And my assumption is that those people can't quickly move into one of these occupations. So that's a very oversimplified story, because I don't think what happens is the economy gets simpler over time, that is, consolidating fewer and fewer occupations. Instead, it gets more complex over time, and sometimes new occupations destroy old ones. So that means that the old ones are no longer sustainable. And all I mean by sustainable is that businesses can make a profit using people with those occupations, using people with those skills. So my interpretation of something like the Great Depression would be that it was a massive shift in the skills or occupations that were sustainable. So a big increase in long distance and mid distance transport, things like trucks. Big increase in using tractors on farms. A big increase in using small motors in factories. The old-fashioned factory of the late 19th and early 20th century was this sort of a 5-story thing with one gigantic motor turning a belt, turning all of the machines in that factory. So it had to be very consolidated vertically. But with the early 20th century and the small electric motor, you could have different motors powering different machines, and you could spread a factory over a larger area. So it was a very different manner of production, and it destroyed a whole bunch of jobs, created different types of jobs. So the losers here were farm laborers, because what they produced, they got driven out by the tractors. Also, with a lot of small farms near cities could be driven out of business by farms farther away from cities because of trucking. And then all sorts of, I'll call it semi-skilled manufacturing work. Things like cigar rolling, blowing glass for light bulbs. That was actually a job in the early part of the 20th century. But a lot of those things disappear as you get the more efficient factory run by a lot of small motors, and then just a lot of people invent lots of ways to substitute small motors for different types of labor. So what that requires then is a whole new pattern for employing people. And my description of the Depression, Great Depression, is that people couldn't find that pattern. That they couldn't figure out in this new complex world what various people should be specializing in. But then we get to the 1950s, and we get a new sort of suburban pattern of specialization in trade. So you get tract housing, famous Levittown, I get a lot of my description of the 50s, by the way, from a book called The 50s by Halberstam. He has a chapter or two on sort of the great businesses that built up in the 50s, one of which was tract housing, another was fast food restaurants. He traces the McDonald's being the sort of the first one to go nationwide there. The national hotels, I guess that's not quite a part of the suburbs, but it was so hotels along highways as people families began to travel more. Okay, and the other big suburban thing was the big discount store and the suburban shopping mall. So I'm going to ignore the hotels thing for a moment. So what most of these things did, particularly the fast food, the discount store, and the shopping mall, is they created a lot of retail jobs, so retail clerk jobs. Okay, so that the jobs from the 1930s that disappeared, so the farm laborers and a lot of the manufacturing jobs never came back after the Second World War. What instead produced the full employment of the 50s was more the retail jobs, and in addition you start to get more middle management type of jobs running businesses, because the businesses are becoming more complex, they're becoming multi-state. They're not just located in one area, they're shipping things across, more businesses are shipping things by truck to other locations, so it's just a more complicated economy that requires more middle management to handle logistics and planning and inventory control and things like that. So let me just fast forward to the last few years, or basically the last decade or two, and once again we've got some technology that's rapidly changing the pattern of production. So you have computers and internet, and now some of these retail clerk jobs are starting to disappear as we develop ways to kind of automate a lot of these sales functions and do it all through websites. A lot of the sales and customer support gets done on computers and the internet. You also very much change the organization of supply chains. You can use a lot more overseas workers a lot more easily and so on. So a lot of disruption from computers and the internet. So we see some big gainers, and we see what we have not yet seen is what we might call a business ecosystem that employs a lot of people. So the big business ecosystems now we can think of as like smartphones. There's a lot of activity developing new smartphones, developing applications, marketing them, and so on. But really not many jobs coming out of that. In fact, it could be that this on net, the computers, internet, smartphone stuff is destroying more jobs than it's creating. Yes, it's creating jobs for web designers and for app developers and all that stuff. But in the process, it's probably destroying a lot of these sort of retail clerk jobs by changing the way that people shop and so on. So the challenge now is to come up with new patterns of sustainable specialization in trade that will restore full employment. And it's I would say it's a difficult challenge. Let me finish up with some of the objections to this PSST view of the world. One is, why can you get something like a sudden recession? Because these sorts of technological changes are happening all the time. The economy is always adjusting. There are always new jobs being created, old jobs being destroyed. We have this survey called the Job Openings and Labor Force Turnover Survey, which shows that there might be, even when the economy is doing well, 6 million jobs per month lost, and then let's say 6.2 million jobs per month gained. So there's all this adjustment going on. How do you explain, and it's happening all the time, and how is it that people can be all of a sudden you lose more jobs than you gain? How can you get a pattern like that? That's a difficult one. One of the stories I would tell for this recession is that we developed some unsustainable patterns in housing construction and housing finance. And also there were a bunch of other patterns that probably were not sustainable long term. So something like Borders Books stays open even though their economic model was no longer viable. They've been basically killed off by Amazon and so already. And then when these other patterns started to fall apart in 2008, the willingness of investors and Borders to kind of keep it open and hope that it would work disappeared, and so that changed, and a lot of businesses decided that to take a look at which operations were viable, how much they could reduce employment, and so they sort of all not together in a conspiratorial way, but all at the same time reached decisions to try to get by with as little labor as possible. So it's not a terrific answer for this question, why a sudden recession. I think that is really the most difficult issue for this patterns of sustainable specialization and trade story. But anyway, I think I will finish on that note and just cut it off there.